The thing about bureaucratic outrage is that it follows predictable patterns across species. Take Ambassador Vex, whose crystalline form was currently cycling through 12 different shades of indignant purple as she gestured at the holographic display floating above the conference table. The Geltar had evolved from mineral deposits that spent millennia perfecting the art of being immovable, which made their current state of agitation all the more remarkable. Completely ignored the Meridian Accords, Vex was saying, her voice creating harmonic resonances that made the station's bulkheads hum. Not challenged them, mind you, ignored them, as if 3,000 years of interspecies law simply doesn't exist. Coordinator Thrum's response came as a chorus of voices speaking in unison, the way it always did when the Nexari Collective was particularly annoyed. The humans established trading relationships with both the Keth Dominion and the Spiral Confederacy, simultaneously, without consulting the territorial boundaries established after the Void Wars. Did they at least file the proper exemption requests? This from Minister Kalen, whose ethereal form flickered with what passed for hope among the void touched. They don't appear to know exemption requests exist, Vex replied, her color shifting to a particularly violent shade of magenta. The Convergence Station's primary conference chamber had hosted diplomatic crises for the better part of 8 centuries. Its designers had optimized everything for maximum procedural efficiency, automated translation matrices, atmospheric adjustment systems that could accommodate 17 different respiratory needs, and enough redundant communication protocols to ensure that even the most xenophobic species could participate in galactic governance without risk of contamination. What they hadn't planned for was humans. "Let me see if I understand this correctly," said Director Moss. His amphibious bulk settled into a specially designed mobility chair. The Hydron Consortium had always prided itself on methodical analysis. These humans have been conducting diplomacy for exactly 14 standard months, and in that time they've managed to accidentally invalidate how many established treaties? Thrum's collective voice carried undertones of mathematical precision. 73 confirmed violations, 216 cases pending review, and somehow, the pause was filled with the kind of silence that suggested even a hive mind needed time to process certain realities. Somehow they've increased overall trade efficiency in their sector by 37%. "That's impossible," Vex said, though her color had shifted to a more uncertain shade of orange. "Economic improvement requires careful resource allocation, managed scarcity, and controlled competitive pressure. You can't just trade with everyone." "Apparently you can," Kalen murmured, his form solidifying slightly as he leaned forward to examine the data streams. "Look at these figures. The humans are sharing agricultural surplus with the Keth, exchanging manufacturing techniques with the Spirals, and somehow convinced both factions to establish joint mining operations in neutral space. The Convergence Station existed specifically because such cooperation was impossible. Every species in the Tertiary Coalition had spent centuries learning the delicate art of managed conflict, maintaining just enough tension to justify the Coalition's existence while avoiding actual wars that might disrupt profitable trade relationships. The humans, it seemed, had missed this crucial lesson entirely. "Where exactly did they learn their diplomatic methods?" Director Moss asked, his throat sac inflating with what his species considered deep concern. "Which Coalition Academy trained their negotiators?" "That's just it," Vex replied, cycling through several shades of confusion. "They didn't attend any of our institutions. Their diplomatic corps appears to consist entirely of volunteers who responded to something called a job posting on their global information network." The silence that followed was the kind that occurs when several highly advanced civilizations simultaneously realize they might be dealing with something completely outside their experience. It was Thrum who finally spoke, their collective voice carefully modulated to hide what sounded suspiciously like nervousness. We've been monitoring their selection criteria. The humans chose their galactic ambassadors based on what they term people skills, genuine curiosity about other cultures, and ability to find common ground. There's no mention of strategic training, economic theory, or proper negotiation protocols. That explains nothing, Vex said, though her color had shifted to deep blue, which among her people indicated profound uncertainty. How can diplomatic amateurs achieve results that our most experienced negotiators consider theoretically impossible? Minister Kalen's form flickered as he accessed additional data streams. Perhaps more concerning is their apparent inability to maintain proper enemy classifications. According to our intelligence reports, their diplomatic teams have been socializing with representatives from species that have been in formal opposition for centuries. Socializing? Director Moss's throat sac deflated abruptly. Sharing meals, exchanging personal histories. One report mentions humans organizing what they called a cultural exchange program between Keth military commanders and spiral artistic guilds. Kalen's voice carried the tone of someone describing a particularly disturbing nightmare. The participants apparently had a great time. Vex's crystalline structure actually creaked as she shifted position. This is precisely why we called this emergency session. The humans aren't just violating established protocols, they're making those protocols appear arbitrary. Because they are arbitrary, Thrum said, then immediately added, which is entirely beside the point. Arbitrary doesn't mean ineffective. Our current system has maintained galactic stability for nearly a millennium. Has it, though? The question came from Director Moss, who had been studying the economic data with increasing bewilderment. If a species of diplomatic novices can achieve better outcomes in 14 months than we've managed in 8 centuries, perhaps we need to reconsider what we mean by stability. The conference chamber's environmental systems registered a collective spike in stress pheromones as 3 distinct civilizations simultaneously confronted an uncomfortable possibility that their entire approach to galactic governance might be fundamentally flawed. The human representative was supposed to appear before this tribunal, Vex said, apparently deciding that returning to procedural matters was safer than contemplating existential questions about diplomatic theory. They were formally summoned to account for their species' irregular behavior. Yes, about that, Kalen said, his form solidifying into what passed for a grimace among his people. I've been monitoring communication channels from the human sector. Their representative appears to be delayed. Delayed how? They stopped to mediate a border dispute between 2 minor species who have been feuding for the past 60 years. According to the latest reports, they've convinced both sides to establish a joint cultural festival celebrating their shared historical traditions. The silence that followed was broken only by the gentle hum of the station's environmental processors and what sounded distinctly like Director Moss grinding his teeth. They're not coming, are they? Vex asked, her color cycling through what looked like the entire spectrum of crystalline exasperation. Oh, they're coming, Thrum replied, their collective voice carrying undertones of grim certainty. But they're going to arrive expecting us to be reasonable. And there, in that single statement, lay the heart of the problem that would soon reshape galactic civilization. The humans actually expected everyone else to be reasonable. It was, the assembled diplomats were beginning to realize, possibly the most dangerous assumption anyone had ever made about galactic politics. The human who eventually wandered into the Convergent Station's primary tribunal chamber looked exactly like someone who had spent the past 6 hours mediating a border dispute. Slightly rumpled, carrying what appeared to be a bag of snacks from 3 different worlds, and wearing the kind of expression that suggested she was still processing something particularly absurd. Sorry I'm late, she said, settling into the defendant's chair with the casual air of someone attending a mildly interesting faculty meeting. The Zelani and the Morduk were having this whole thing about historical fishing rights, but it turns out they've both been fishing the same nebula for generations and just never talked to each other about scheduling. Weird how that works out, right? Ambassador Vex's crystalline form had gone completely transparent, which was either a sign of extreme shock or an involuntary defense mechanism. You resolved a 60-year territorial conflict by suggesting they coordinate their fishing schedules? Well, that and setting up a joint processing facility. Turns out they both specialize in different parts of the same extraction process. The Zelani are brilliant at net weaving, and the Morduk have these amazing preservation techniques. They're talking about franchising the whole operation now. The human, her identification badge read Doctor. Elena Vasquez, Earth Diplomatic Corps, pulled what looked like dried seaweed from her snack bag and offered it around the table. Want some? It's really good, kind of smoky. Director Moss found his voice first, though it came out as more of a croak. Dr. Vasquez, you do understand why you've been summoned before this tribunal? Honestly, not really. She chewed thoughtfully on her seaweed. The summons mentioned something about irregular diplomatic practices, but the translation software might have glitched. I got the impression you folks wanted to chat about how things were going in our sector. Coordinator Thrum's collective voice took on the carefully modulated tone of someone explaining basic concepts to a particularly dense child. Your species has violated 73 established treaties, disrupted traditional alliance structures, and created unauthorized economic partnerships across 16 different sectors. Elena blinked. Okay, but has anyone been hurt by this? Because our preliminary reports show pretty significant improvements in resource distribution, conflict resolution, and general satisfaction metrics across all the regions we've been working in. That is precisely the problem, Minister Kalen said, his ethereal form flickering with agitation. Galactic civilization functions through carefully maintained balance. Competition drives innovation. Scarcity ensures proper resource allocation. Controlled tensions prevent catastrophic wars. But why? Elena asked, and the simple question seemed to physically impact everyone in the room. I mean, if cooperation produces better outcomes with fewer casualties and higher general welfare, why would you deliberately choose the alternative? The silence that followed was the kind that occurs when someone asks a question so fundamentally naive that it threatens to expose the arbitrary nature of an entire civilization's foundational assumptions. Vex recovered first, her color cycling through what looked like an entire rainbow of diplomatic strain. Dr. Vasquez, galactic society has evolved over millennia to balance the competing needs of hundreds of species. The current system prevents chaos. Does it, though? Elena pulled out what appeared to be a datapad cobbled together from parts of at least 4 different technological systems. Because I've been looking at your historical records. Fascinating stuff, by the way. And it seems like you've had pretty much continuous low-level warfare for the past 800 years. That doesn't sound super stable to me. Thrum's collective voice carried undertones of barely controlled frustration. Those conflicts serve essential regulatory functions. They provide outlets for territorial expansion needs, maintain technological development pressure, and ensure that no single species becomes dominant enough to threaten galactic balance. Right, but what if species didn't have territorial expansion needs? Elena asked, apparently oblivious to the way her question was causing several advanced civilizations to question their most basic assumptions about biology and sociology. What if, instead of fighting over resources, they just shared them? Species require territory, Director Moss stated with the authority of someone citing a fundamental law of physics. Do they? Because the Keth and the Spirals seemed pretty happy to set up joint operations once they realized they could both benefit more from cooperation than competition. And the Morduke and Zelani were practically neighbors for 60 years, without realizing they could help each other instead of fighting over nebula access. Minister Kalen's form solidified into what looked suspiciously like the ethereal equivalent of clutching one's head. You cannot simply ignore millennia of evolutionary psychology and social development theory. I'm not ignoring it, Elena said, offering him some of what appeared to be crystallized fruit from a different planet. I'm just questioning whether evolutionary behaviors that were adaptive in one context necessarily remain optimal when the context changes. Humans used to fight wars over salt and spices, but once we figured out global trade networks, those conflicts became pointless. Your species fought wars over seasoning? Vex asked, her color shifting to what looked like morbid fascination. Oh yeah, absolutely vicious ones. People died horrible deaths over access to black pepper. But then we developed better transportation, communication systems, and trade relationships, and suddenly everyone could have all the seasoning they wanted. Problem solved. Elena shrugged. Same principle applies to galactic resources, doesn't it? You've got faster-than-light travel, universal translation, and enough technological advancement to terraform planets. Why are you still operating under scarcity-based economic models? The question hung in the air like a small explosive device, waiting for someone to accidentally trigger it. Because, Thrum said slowly, their collective voice carrying undertones of uncertainty, scarcity drives technological innovation and prevents social stagnation. But you just said you've had the same basic political and economic structures for 800 years, Elena pointed out. How is that not stagnation? Director Moss's throat sac inflated and deflated several times before he managed to speak. Dr. Vasquez, you appear to be suggesting that our entire approach to galactic civilization is fundamentally flawed. I'm not suggesting anything, Elena said, pulling out what looked like notes scribbled on napkins from at least 6 different worlds. I'm just asking questions, like, why do the Hydron Consortium and the Crystalline Assembly maintain formal hostility when your species share almost identical environmental needs and could obviously benefit from resource sharing? Or why the Void-Touched restrict their dimensional research when collaborating with the Nexari Collective would probably advance both civilizations by centuries? Because, Vex said, though her color had shifted to uncertain orange again, those relationships would disrupt established power balances. Okay, but whose power? And balanced against what? Elena looked genuinely curious. Because, from what I can tell, the current system mostly benefits the people who get to manage the conflicts, not the species actually living with the consequences. The Tribunal Chamber's environmental systems registered another spike in collective stress indicators as 4 separate civilizations simultaneously realized that a human diplomat, armed with nothing more than curiosity and common sense, had just identified the fundamental contradiction at the heart of their entire political structure. Dr. Vasquez, Minister Kalen said carefully, are you suggesting that the Tertiary Coalition itself is the source of galactic instability? I'm not suggesting anything, Elena repeated, offering around what appeared to be some kind of fermented beverage. I'm just wondering why everyone seems so invested in maintaining problems that have obvious solutions. And with that observation, delivered in the same tone someone might use to comment on unusual weather patterns, Dr. Elena Vasquez had accidentally identified the exact reason why her species represented an existential threat to galactic civilization as they knew it. The emergency recess lasted exactly 47 minutes, during which time the assembled representatives engaged in what could charitably be called frantic consultation with their respective governments, and what could more accurately be described as barely controlled panic. Dr. Vasquez spent the same period chatting with various station personnel about their working conditions, somehow learning that the janitorial staff hadn't received a pay adjustment in 36 years, and that the food service workers were apparently dealing with some kind of supply chain inefficiency that made fresh produce cost more than rare metals. When the tribunal reconvened, Director Moss had clearly decided to take a more direct approach. Dr. Vasquez, your species' diplomatic methods are causing significant disruption to established galactic order. The Coalition requires assurance that humanity will adopt standard diplomatic protocols going forward. Or what? Elena asked, and it wasn't a challenge so much as genuine curiosity. Economic sanctions, Vex replied, her crystalline form now cycling through what looked like pre-programmed threat displays. Trade restrictions, quarantine protocols, ultimately, if necessary, military intervention to protect galactic stability. Elena tilted her head slightly, the way someone might when trying to figure out if a friend was joking. You'd go to war to force us to be less effective at preventing wars. We would take necessary action to preserve the system that has maintained galactic peace for centuries, Thrum stated with the kind of collective certainty that suggested they'd been rehearsing this line. Okay, Elena said, pulling out her cobbled-together datapad again. How about we test that? You folks keep talking about this system of yours like it's the only thing preventing chaos. Want to see what happens when someone actually tries to solve one of your unsolvable problems? Minister Kalen's ethereal form flickered nervously. What exactly are you proposing? Pick something. Any long-standing conflict that your coalition has been managing for decades. Give me 24 hours to work on it, and we'll see what happens. Elena's smile was the kind that suggested she was looking forward to an interesting puzzle. If I make things worse, humanity withdraws from galactic politics entirely. If I improve the situation, maybe we can discuss why your methods aren't working. The four representatives exchanged the kind of meaningful looks that pass between experienced bureaucrats when someone has just walked into an obvious trap. Director Moss was the first to speak. The Kythera dispute, he said with satisfaction. 2 client species, the Ravagers and the Architects, have been locked in territorial war for 8 centuries. The conflict provides essential military training opportunities, prevents both species from developing dangerous independence movements, and generates considerable revenue through weapons contracts and reconstruction efforts. Perfect, Elena said, making notes on what appeared to be the back of a food wrapper. What do they actually want? I mean, not what the Coalition thinks they should want, but what would make each species genuinely satisfied? Vex's color shifted to incredulous purple. Dr. Vasquez, this is precisely the kind of naive thinking that makes your species so dangerous. The Ravagers want to expand their territory through conquest. The Architects want to preserve their ancient construction sites. These are fundamentally incompatible objectives. Are they? Elena asked, still scribbling notes. Or is that just how the conflict has been framed? Can I talk to representatives from both species? Absolutely not, Thrum replied immediately. Direct communication between the factions could destabilize the entire management structure we've spent centuries developing. Wow, okay, that sounds like it might be part of the problem right there. Elena looked up from her notes with the expression of someone who'd just realized they were watching a particularly elaborate practical joke. You've been managing a war for 8 centuries without letting the people fighting it talk to each other? Communication between hostile species requires careful mediation through neutral coalition representatives, Minister Kalen explained with the patience of someone reciting fundamental policy. Direct contact could lead to escalation, or worse, unauthorized resolution. Elena stared at him for a long moment. Did you just say unauthorized resolution like it was a bad thing? Unauthorized resolutions create precedents that undermine coalition authority, Director Moss stated firmly. If species began resolving conflicts independently, the entire regulatory framework would collapse. Right, because then you wouldn't be needed anymore, Elena said. and the observation landed with the subtlety of a meteor impact. The silence that followed was broken by the soft chime of Elena's datapad, receiving an incoming message. She glanced at it, smiled, and looked back up at the increasingly uncomfortable tribunal. "Funny thing about humans," she said conversationally. "We're really bad at following rules that don't make sense to us. So while you folks were deciding what I could and couldn't do, my colleagues were already reaching out to Ravager and Architect representatives through independent channels." Vex's crystalline structure actually creaked as she leaned forward. "That's impossible. Coalition protocols specifically prohibit—" "Coalition protocols prohibit a lot of things," Elena interrupted gently. "But they only apply to coalition members, and technically, humanity isn't a coalition member yet. We're just visitors." Her datapad chimed again, followed by a series of soft notification sounds that suggested multiple incoming communications. Elena glanced at the display and nodded approvingly. "Turns out the Ravagers aren't actually interested in conquest," she announced. "They're nomadic by nature, and what they really want is guaranteed safe passage through the disputed territories, so they can follow traditional migration routes that your war has been blocking for 8 centuries. "That's impossible," Thrum stated with collective certainty. "The Ravagers are an aggressive, expansion-focused civilization." "According to who?" Elena asked, showing them her datapad. "Because according to actual Ravagers, they've been trying to negotiate passage rights for generations, but coalition mediators keep insisting the conflict is about territorial acquisition." More chimes from her device. Elena's smile widened. "And the architects don't actually care about preserving construction sites. They're builders. They want to build new things. What they've been fighting for is access to the raw materials their ancestors used, which happen to be located in Ravager migration territories." Director Moss's throat sac had deflated completely. "Dr. Vasquez, even if those claims were accurate, the logistical challenges of coordinating resource extraction with migration schedules would be already solved," Elena said cheerfully. "Turns out Ravager migration patterns follow seasonal resource availability, and Architect construction cycles are based on material acquisition schedules. They're naturally synchronized. The Architects agreed to build way stations along traditional migration routes, and the Ravagers offered to help with materials transport using their existing logistics networks." "In the past 4 hours?" Vex's color had cycled through the entire spectrum and was now flickering between disbelief and something approaching horror. "Actually, they figured it out in about 20 minutes once they started talking to each other. The rest of the time was spent working out details and celebrating." Elena held up her datapad, which was displaying what looked like party planning documents. "They're organizing a joint cultural festival to commemorate the new partnership. The Architects are building a massive celebration amphitheater, and the Ravagers are contributing some kind of traditional fire dance that sounds absolutely amazing." The tribunal chamber's environmental systems registered atmospheric conditions that suggested several species were having simultaneous respiratory distress. "Dr. Vasquez," Minister Kalin said slowly, "do you understand what you've just done? Helped 2 groups of people solve a problem that was making them miserable for 800 years? Elena suggested. "I mean, I know it's not as profitable as selling weapons to both sides, but it seems like the kind of thing most reasonable beings would consider an improvement." And there it was again. That word that kept appearing in human discourse, like a virus designed to infect rational political structures. Reasonable. As if the entire universe were supposed to operate according to principles of basic decency and common sense. The assembled representatives sat in stunned silence as they realized they had just witnessed their entire approach to conflict management dissolve in less than half a day, replaced by something so simple it felt like mockery. 2 species talking to each other about what they actually wanted. "This cannot be allowed to stand," Vex said finally, her voice carrying harmonics of desperation. Elena looked genuinely surprised. Why not? Everyone's happy, the problem's solved, and nobody has to die over migration routes anymore. What's wrong with that? What was wrong, the coalition representatives were beginning to understand, was that it worked. And if it worked here, it could work anywhere. Which meant that humanity hadn't just solved one carefully maintained conflict. They had accidentally demonstrated that most conflicts could probably be resolved by the radical technique of asking people what they actually wanted and then helping them figure out how to get it. Dr. Vasquez, Director Moss said with the tone of someone delivering a final ultimatum, the coalition cannot permit this precedent to spread. Elena's expression shifted slightly, and for the first time since entering the chamber, she looked less like a confused academic and more like someone who had just realized she was dealing with people who preferred problems to solutions. That's unfortunate, she said quietly, because it's probably too late to stop it. The threat came exactly as Elena had expected it would, with all the bureaucratic precision that 8 centuries of galactic governance could muster. Director Moss cleared his throat with the ceremonial authority of someone about to pronounce judgment on behalf of civilization itself. Dr. Vasquez, the Tertiary Coalition hereby issues an ultimatum to the human species. You have 72 standard hours to cease all unauthorized diplomatic activities, withdraw from non-coalition territories, and submit to proper regulatory oversight. Failure to comply will result in immediate implementation of protective measures. Elena nodded thoughtfully, pulling out what appeared to be a different communication device entirely. Something sleek and clearly more advanced than her previous cobbled-together equipment. Protective measures. That's an interesting euphemism. You mean you're going to attack Earth? We mean we will take whatever action becomes necessary to preserve galactic stability, Vex replied, her crystalline form now glowing with what looked suspiciously like weapons-charging energy patterns. Before you do that, Elena said, activating her device, you might want to take a look at what's been happening while we've been chatting. The holographic display that materialized above the conference table was considerably more sophisticated than anything the Coalition had been using. It showed a real-time map of known galactic space, with communication networks, trade routes, and political boundaries rendered in flowing, interconnected patterns that seemed to pulse with live data. Pretty, isn't it? Elena said conversationally. One of the things humans are good at is information systems. We've been mapping your entire civilization for the past 14 months, not for intelligence purposes, but because we like to understand how things work before we try to help. Thrum's collective voice carried undertones of unease. This display shows classified coalition infrastructure data. It shows publicly available information that nobody bothered to compile before, Elena corrected. Turns out when you start asking questions about how galactic society actually functions, people are pretty eager to share, especially when they realize someone's finally listening. The map zoomed in to show individual sectors, then expanded again to display what looked like a cascade of changing status indicators spreading across multiple star systems. Elena watched the display with the satisfaction of someone observing a particularly elegant scientific experiment. See, the thing about humans is that we're really, really bad at keeping secrets when we think something might help someone. So, while I was here getting yelled at for solving problems, my colleagues were out there doing what humans do, asking questions, making friends, and accidentally starting revolutions. Revolutions? Minister Kalen's ethereal form was flickering so rapidly he was barely visible. Well, that's probably too strong a word, more like awakening. Elena gestured to the display, where status indicators were shifting from red to green across vast swaths of galactic territory. Amazing what happens when you tell people they don't have to be enemies just because some bureaucrats 3 star systems away think it's profitable. Director Moss was staring at the display with the expression of someone watching their entire worldview collapse in real time. This is impossible. The Coalition has regulatory oversight of all major diplomatic initiatives. The Coalition has regulatory oversight of coalition diplomatic initiatives, Elena agreed. But it turns out that when species start talking to each other directly, they don't actually need regulatory oversight. Who knew? The map pulsed, highlighting new data streams that showed what appeared to be cascading treaty negotiations, resource-sharing agreements, and collaborative projects spreading across the galaxy like some kind of beneficial infection. The Hegemony and the Drift states just signed a mutual defense pact, Elena announced, reading from her device. Apparently they've had compatible military doctrines for centuries, but never realized it because coalition mediators kept insisting they needed buffer zones. The Synthetic Collective and the Biopurists are establishing joint research initiatives, and the Nomad fleets have agreed to provide transport services for anyone who needs to relocate during the massive reorganization that's apparently happening everywhere. Vex's color had gone completely white, which among her people indicated either transcendental enlightenment or total system shutdown. You've destroyed galactic civilization. Have we? Elena asked, genuinely curious. Because according to these metrics, intersystem violence is down 68%. Resource distribution efficiency has improved by factors I don't even have numbers for, and general population satisfaction indicators are showing improvements across every measured parameter. But the structure, Thrum began. What structure? Elena interrupted, not unkindly. The one where a handful of bureaucrats decide which species are allowed to be friends and which ones have to fight over resources that exist in abundance? That structure? Her device chimed with incoming communications, and Elena glanced at the data stream with growing amusement. Oh, this is interesting. The Coalition's client species are filing formal requests to withdraw from dependency status. Apparently, when people realize they can solve their own problems, they stop needing someone else to solve problems for them. This is chaos, Director Moss whispered. This is Tuesday, Elena replied, or whatever day it is in Galactic Standard Time. I can never keep track of calendars that aren't based on actual planetary rotation periods. The holographic display updated again, showing communication networks spreading across previously isolated sectors as species that had been kept apart for generations began establishing direct contact. Elena watched the cascade of connections with the kind of quiet satisfaction that suggested she had expected exactly this outcome. The beautiful thing about humans, she said, addressing the increasingly catatonic tribunal, is that we genuinely believe other people are basically decent. It's probably our most dangerous characteristic from your perspective. We meet someone new, and our first instinct isn't to figure out how to control them or profit from them. It's to figure out how to be friends with them. But competition drives innovation, Vex managed to say, though her voice sounded hollow. Conflict prevents stagnation. Scarcity ensures proper resource allocation. Does it? Elena asked, and somehow she managed to make the question sound like the most natural thing in the universe. Because it looks to me like cooperation drives innovation, collaboration prevents stagnation, and abundance ensures that everyone gets what they need to be happy and productive. The silence that settled over the conference chamber was different from the previous pauses in conversation. This wasn't the silence of bureaucrats processing unexpected information. This was the silence of people watching their entire reason for existing dissolve into irrelevance. What happens to us? Minister Kalen asked finally, his ethereal form barely maintaining coherence. Elena looked genuinely surprised by the question. What do you mean? You're all clearly intelligent, experienced individuals with valuable skills. I'm sure there are plenty of constructive things you could do once you're not spending all your time managing artificial conflicts. But the Coalition will probably need to find a new mission statement, Elena said gently. Maybe something focused on facilitating cooperation instead of managing competition? There's going to be a lot of coordination needed as species figure out new ways to work together. Sounds like exactly the kind of challenge experienced administrators would be good at solving. She stood up, gathering her various devices and snack packages with the casual efficiency of someone wrapping up a successful business meeting. I should probably head back to help with the transition planning. Turns out when several hundred civilizations simultaneously realize they can cooperate instead of competing, there's a lot of logistics involved. Dr. Vasquez, Director Moss called as she reached the chamber's exit. What if you're wrong? What if this cooperation experiment fails? What if species need competition and conflict to thrive? Elena paused at the doorway and turned back with a smile that suggested she had been waiting for exactly that question. Then we'll figure out something else, she said. That's what humans do when something doesn't work. We try different approaches until we find one that does. It's probably our second most dangerous characteristic, from your perspective. And with that observation, delivered with the same casual confidence she had maintained throughout the entire proceedings, Dr. Elena Vasquez walked out of the chamber and left 4 of the galaxy's most experienced diplomats sitting in stunned silence as they contemplated a universe where their most fundamental assumptions about civilization had just been revealed as elaborate solutions to problems that didn't actually need to exist. The holographic display continued updating, showing the spread of cooperation and collaboration across galactic space, like sunrise across a previously darkened world. And in that gentle light, the Coalition representatives finally understood what they were looking at. Not the destruction of civilization, but its evolution into something their predecessors had never dared to imagine possible. The thing about bureaucratic collapse, it turned out, was that it followed entirely predictable patterns across species. The only difference was that this time, nobody seemed particularly interested in rebuilding what had fallen. Outside the chamber, Elena was already planning her next impossible project, teaching the galaxy's most experienced conflict managers how to become its first cooperation specialists. It would probably take a few months, but then again, humans had always been optimistic about timelines. After all, they expected everyone else to be reasonable. It was, as several civilizations were beginning to discover, a remarkably effective form of prophecy.